Okay, so we're diving into something that's probably on a lot of your minds right now, especially if you're a teacher in a state where school vouchers are either a thing already or, something that could very well happen soon.
Yeah, it's a hot topic.
It is. So we're going to really cut through all the back and forth and all the noise and really try to figure out what exactly these vouchers are. How are these proposals in Texas like really shaping up? What are the arguments for and against them? And what have other states gone through with these. So our goal with this deep dive is to really give you a clear picture of this complicated issue. And we're going to be looking at, some recent reporting and analysis.
Right. So for this one, we've put together information from a few key sources so we can, give you a full picture. We'll be taking a close look at the Texas Association of School Boards, that's TASB, and how they see this whole school choice and voucher situation. We've also got some great reporting from the Texas Tribune. They've been covering this whole voucher debate in Texas really in depth. And we're also going to be looking at some different perspectives from Raise Your Hand Texas. They've been pretty vocal about their opposition to these programs.
And why is this so important for you, the listener? Well, especially if you're a teacher, because the decisions being made about school vouchers could totally change the world of education that you're a part of every day.
It's true.
It could impact you, your classrooms, your students, and even like the whole structure of public education in your state.
Huge implications.
Huge. So let's just get right into it. What exactly are these vouchers everyone's talking about, and how does this whole idea of school choice fit into this picture?
Yeah. Okay. So let's break it down. Vouchers. It's kind of a big umbrella term. It covers a bunch of different ways that taxpayer money could be used to support education outside of the regular public schools. And the people who are for this, they usually talk about it in terms of school choice, giving parents more control over where their kids go to school.
Right. So it's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of thing, right? Our sources mentioned there's actually like different types of voucher programs.
Exactly. There are a few different ways this can work. You've got traditional vouchers where parents get money directly to help pay for private school tuition. Then there are education savings accounts, ESAs. Those are like state-managed accounts that parents can use for all sorts of education expenses. Like if they decide to take their kids out of public school tax credit scholarships, those give tax breaks to people who donate to organizations that give scholarships for private school. There are also vouchers specifically for certain groups of students and even virtual vouchers for online private schools.
So the Texas Tribune's been reporting a lot on the ESA model, especially how Governor Abbott's been pushing for it. Can you tell us more about how that might work in Texas?
Sure. So what's really interesting about these proposed ESAs in Texas is that they're supposed to be super flexible. Governor Abbott's been a big supporter of these part. The idea is to set up these accounts managed by the state for parents who choose to take their kids out of public schools. And they can use this money not just for private school tuition, but potentially for other education costs too, like tutoring curriculum materials, even homeschooling expenses, depending on how the law is finally written. So that broad range of things you can use the money for, that's a key part of the ESA model.
That does sound like a big shift from how we usually fund public schools. But then on the flip side, TASB is saying that Texas public schools already give you a lot of choices.
Right, and that's an important point to think about.
Yeah.
TASB is basically saying, look, within the public school system in Texas, families already have a lot of options.
Yeah.
They've got magnet schools with special programs for different interests. They've got charter schools, which are public but have more freedom. There are online public school programs for more flexibility and even open enrollment policies where families can sometimes choose schools within or even between districts.
Okay.
So their argument is, we've already got a pretty good system in place that gives people choices without taking money away from public schools and giving it to private organizations that don't have as much public oversight. It does make you wonder, though, how effective are those existing choices really? Are they enough to meet the demand that people who support vouchers are talking about?
So we've got these two different ways of looking at school choice in Texas.
Yeah.
Now, let's look at what's actually happening right now with this whole voucher thing.
Yeah.
It seems like there's been a lot of back and forth.
Oh, yeah. The Texas Tribune's been covering this, and it's clear that getting a voucher program in Texas has been a big goal for lawmakers, especially Governor Abbott, with 2025 being the target date. But it hasn't been easy. The 2023 legislative session saw a bunch of voucher proposals kind of die in the House. And What's interesting is that it wasn't just a party line thing. You had some rural Republicans joining the Democrats to vote against these proposals.
Okay.
And it seemed like they were worried about what it would do to their local public schools.
Yeah, and Governor Abbott wasn't just going to sit back and let that happen,
Yeah.
right? The Tribune talks about how he got involved in those 2024 primaries.
Exactly. He really made it a point to campaign against those Republican House members who
Huh.
voted against vouchers and support the challengers who were pro-vouchers.
Yeah.
So he's really been shaking things up, and that could make a big difference in this current legislative session.
Okay, so knowing all that, what do these Texas voucher proposals actually look like? Right now, we know the Senate and the House have come up with different versions.
Right. So both chambers have put out their initial plans. Senate Bill 2, the one from the Senate, that suggested giving families who leave public schools an ESA worth $10,000 per kid each year. That would go up to $11,500 for students with disabilities. And they also talked about giving at least $2,000 a year for kids who are homeschooled.
And how does the House version compare, like, in terms of how much money they're talking about and who qualify?
So the House version, House Bill 3, does it a little differently instead of a fixed amount. They want to tie it to 85% of what public schools get per student from state and local sources. The Texas Education Agency estimates that could be around $10,893 per student each year. And just like the Senate bill, they'd give more for students with disabilities. The House also included a cap of $2,000 per year for homeschooling. It's worth pointing out, though, that this whole per student public school funding from state and local sources thing, it might not be so clear to people who aren't, deep in the world of school finance. Basically, it includes the basic funding the state provides, plus local tax money that goes to schools and often extra money for specific groups of students or special programs.
Okay, so there are some things that are the same and some key differences between these two proposals. It seems like both would cover pretty much all school-aged kids, even those already in private school, and neither one says private schools have to accept all students or follow all the same rules that public schools do if they want to take voucher money.
Right. That's really important to understand. If private schools don't have to accept everyone, that raises concerns about whether some students might be left out. Plus, if they don't have to follow the same rules as public schools, like state accountability standards, open records laws, special ed rules, and set curriculum requirements, well, that's a big point of debate.
Absolutely.
There are some differences in the amount of money each proposal is talking about, and the Senate's version is more clear about how much homeschooling would get. Both are aiming to give extra help to students with disabilities and lower-income families, although the House uses a more complicated system based on income to decide who's eligible.
Okay, so now we have a better idea of what these school vouchers are and what specific plans are being talked about in Texas. Let's get into the heart of the debate, the arguments for and against these programs. What are the main points from people who are for vouchers?
Okay, so from a more conservative point of view, a big argument is about parents' rights. They believe parents should have more choices when it comes to their kids' education, especially if they think their local public schools aren't safe or are doing a bad job. They say vouchers give parents, especially those who don't have a lot of money, the power to choose schools that they think are better for their kids' needs and how they learn.
And we hear a lot about how this competition from vouchers would actually make public schools better, right?
Definitely, they argue that if vouchers are an option, public schools will have to step up their game to keep students. We also see a lot of support from religious groups who see vouchers as a way to make private religious education more affordable for families, no matter their financial situation. And like we talked about earlier, some homeschooling families also like vouchers or ESAs because they see it as financial help that recognizes their choices about education.
The Texas Tribune also mentioned all the money being poured into supporting candidates who are for vouchers. Where's all that money coming from, and what does that tell us?
That's an interesting piece of the puzzle. A lot of that money is coming from people and organizations outside of Texas, like Jeff Yass from Pennsylvania. These are people who have been pushing for school choice all over the country and are pretty critical of public education as it is. So this big influx of money from out of state does make you wonder, is this whole voucher movement in Texas really about what people here want, or is it part of a bigger national agenda to change how education works?
Okay, so we've got a good grasp on the arguments for vouchers. Now, let's look at the other side. What are the main arguments against vouchers? This is where groups like TASB and Raise Your Hand Texas have been really vocal.
Exactly. One of their biggest worries is that voucher programs could take much needed funding away from public schools that are already struggling. Texas already doesn't spend that much per student compared to other states, and they're afraid that if kids start using vouchers to go to private schools, the public schools that are left behind will have even less money to educate the majority of students.
Right, and that brings up a really important question for teachers. How would this shift in funding affect what you have available in your classrooms?
Exactly. And our sources point to what's happened in other states to show how this could play out.
Like where?
Well, Florida's a good example. They've really expanded their voucher programs over the last decade or so. And during certain periods, that happened at the same time as a pretty big drop in how much they spend per student in public schools. And Arizona shows us that these voucher programs can end up costing way more than originally planned, which puts a lot of strain on state budgets and could lead to cuts in other important public services. So these examples are kind of a warning about what could happen financially down the road.
So beyond the money directly going to public schools, what else are people worried about? Accountability seems like a big one.
Absolutely. A big concern is that private schools that would get this voucher money wouldn't have to be as accountable or transparent as public schools. Under the current proposals in Texas, these private schools wouldn't have to meet the same state standards as public schools. They wouldn't necessarily be subject to those open records laws that make things transparent for the public. They might not have to follow the same special ed regulations, and their curriculum requirements could be all over the place. TASB specifically says that vouchers basically take the power away from school boards that are accountable to the public and give it to private organizations that might be more interested in making money or following the wishes of their own private board of directors. This lack of public oversight raises some serious questions about how well that taxpayer money would be used and if all students would really be getting a good education.
And it's not just about these big policy questions, right? What about how this would affect specific communities, especially in rural areas?
Yeah, that's a crucial point that both TASB and the Texas Tribune bring up. In a lot of rural communities in Texas, the local public school is way more than just a place where kids go to learn.
It's the heart of the town.
Exactly.
Mm.
It's a big employer, a source of pride, and it really ties the community together.
Mm.
Historically, rural lawmakers have been against voucher programs because they see them as a threat to these important local institutions, especially since many rural areas don't have a lot of private schools or any at all. So for teachers in these communities, the potential impact of vouchers could be huge.
And then there's the whole debate about the very idea of public education, what it is, what it should be.
Right. Some people who are against vouchers think this whole push is really about weakening the idea of a public education system for everyone, and they worry that using public money for private schools could lead to certain religious values being promoted. And it's interesting because some homeschooling families are actually against vouchers too. They're worried that if they start taking government money, they'll have to follow more rules and lose some of their freedom to do things their own way.
So there are a lot of different concerns here. So what does the research say about how students who use vouchers actually do academically?
Well, the research on how vouchers affect kids' learning is complicated, and people are still debating it. But our sources mention some studies, like one done in Louisiana, that found strong and consistent evidence that students using a scholarship to attend private schools performed significantly worse in math. And a bigger review of research back in 2017 concluded that there wasn't enough strong evidence to say that vouchers are a reliable way to improve student achievement across the board. In fact, in some cases, like we saw in Louisiana, these programs have even been linked to kids doing worse academically. So it's not as simple as some people make it seem.
It sounds really messy.
Yeah, it is.
So let's zoom out a bit and look at what's happened in other states that already have voucher programs. What can Texas learn from them?
Yeah. There are definitely some lessons to be learned. One thing we've seen is that even though some voucher programs are meant to help low-income students, a lot of the bigger ones have ended up mostly benefiting wealthier families who are already sending their kids to private school. So that makes you wonder, is the real goal here to help disadvantaged students, or is it more about helping a wider range of families? That's something for teachers to really think about. Who are the real winners when these programs are put in place?
And we've heard about some cases where voucher money has been used in ways that raise some eyebrows. Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, there have been reports of voucher money being spent on things that don't seem right in places like Florida and Arizona.
Like what?
Well, in Florida, they've apparently approved spending voucher money on things like flat screen TVs and even theme park tickets.
Really?
I know it sounds crazy. And in Arizona, it's been even worse. There have been reports of a lot of taxpayer money being used for things like chicken coops and trampolines.
Yeah.
Seriously. So this shows us that there's a real chance of this money being misused. And it's hard to keep track of how it's all being spent when it goes to private organizations that don't have the same level of public scrutiny as public schools.
And what about how people feel about vouchers in other states? Have voters gotten to actually vote on this?
That's a good point. While these debates usually happen in state legislatures, there have been a few states where voters got to directly vote on voucher proposals through ballot initiatives, like in Kentucky, Nebraska, and Colorado. And in all of those cases, the voters said no. So that tells us that people are pretty divided on this issue, and sometimes what lawmakers decide isn't really what the people want.
Which brings us to public opinion here in Texas. What did the polls say about how Texans feel about school vouchers?
The polls we've seen show mixed feelings about these voucher-like programs in Texas, and the Texas Tribune pointed out that how they ask the questions in these polls can really change the results. Some polls show that most Texans like the general idea of school choice, but when they specifically mention taking tax money away from public schools to fund private schools, more people are against it. So it's important to really look closely at how these polls are done and what words they use.
And even though Governor Abbott said that the results of the 2024 primaries show that people clearly want vouchers, the actual numbers paint a different picture.
That's right. Even though he said it was a big win for his stance on vouchers, the data shows that only a small number of Republican primary voters said school vouchers were a main reason they voted for certain House candidates. And like we talked about before, Texans haven't had a chance to directly vote on this whole voucher thing in a statewide election.
So bringing it back to you, the listener, especially if you're a teacher in a state where this is all happening, what are the key things to take away from our deep dive today?
Well, it's pretty clear that this whole debate about school vouchers in Texas and anywhere else, considering it, is complicated, and it could have a big impact on the future of public education and your job. Public schools are saying, hey, we already give families a lot of choices and we're accountable to the public. People who are for vouchers say we need more options for parents and more competition in the education system. And then there's the whole issue of money. How will this affect public school funding? And are these private schools that would get this money really being watched closely enough? Those are all big questions that we need to keep talking about.
Yeah, it definitely shows that there are no easy answers here. So as we wrap up our deep dive, here's something to think about. We looked at different types of vouchers, the pros and cons, what's happened in other states, and how people feel about it all. So based on all of that, what do you think is most important for making sure all students in your state get the best possible education? And what questions or worries do you have about the future of education in your community and your own career? This is a conversation that's still going on, and your voice as a teacher is so important. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.